In the grim darkness of the far future, life sucks. Technology is either not understood, feared, or both. Civil liberties are at their best, you get 2 corpse bars to eat instead of 1. And demons, ancient robotic zombies, and an all-consuming swarm of vor enthusiasts are all tearing the galaxy a new hole, and generally things just aren't great. But what if I told you there was a relatively bright spot in the galaxy? Rather than everyone at all times suffering under the burden of a 10,000-year-old decaying empire, there's a faction in Warhammer that's doing pretty alright, all things considered. Where technology is just technology, not a religion, and the government at least pretends to give a damn about you. Where there's no worlds where life expectancy is measured in months. Are they invincible? Not at all, they're surrounded by overwhelming threats. Are they perfect? Of course not even in the slightest. But if there's anyone you can call a good guy in the miserable hellhole that is Warhammer 40k, it's these fellas. And even if that kind of thing isn't up your alley, giant mech suits are pretty cool, wouldn't you agree? If you don't agree, I'm gonna continue on regardless. So with all that in mind, why don't we go explore the Tau Empire, and if they're the faction for you.
Surrender, human. If not for you, then for the greater good.
The greater good is coming to you from my bolter, alien.
The Tau are a race of blue-skinned fish alien things that live in the very corner of the Warhammer galaxy, right about here. Unlike pretty much everyone else, there's nothing really ancient about them, at least by 40k standards. They're still older than any modern human civilization. No connections to wars 10,000 years ago or even 65 million years ago. No time spent traveling between galaxies, which, if you weren't aware, takes a hot minute to do. Their story begins about 6,000 years ago when the Imperium sent an exploration expedition into the galaxy to poke around for things like archaeotech and more Xenos to kill. They almost achieved the second one of those when they found the primitive Tau of the time, still only at the level of the Stone Age. The Imperium added them to the Purge list so they could colonize the world they were on when all of a sudden warp storms started racking the galaxy. Shrugging their shoulders, the Imperium just listed the whole area of space as lost to chaos and went to deal with the whole evil space pope ruining everything problem that it had at the time. Naturally, you'd think being stranded in a hellstorm would be a death sentence to the Tau, but believe it or not, it wasn't. Their warp presence is minuscule compared to most other factions, so the demons that would have been in the area just didn't notice them. Imagine sneaking in a Bethesda game when the skill is maxed out and you've got a pretty good idea of what it was like for them, just not intentional. Unperturbed and in fact ignorant of what was going on around them, the Tau advanced through the tech tree, and at one point, roughly around the Bronze or Iron Age equivalent for us, they had divided themselves into 4 nations based on Avatar: The Last Airbender. There was water, earth, fire, and air, and none of them could beat the rest. And so it was total Warhammer 37k. That was awful. Cut that out. Eventually, a mysterious 5th group of Tau known as the Ethereals united them. First, they appeared at a siege between 2 of these nations and convinced each side to just quit it with all the fighting if they wouldn't mind. Then they convinced every other Tau on the planet to make nice with each other, and soon enough, the never-ending Tau Golden Age had begun. The former nations organized themselves based on the things they excelled at before into a caste system. Fire Tau were the strongest, so they became the Fire Warrior caste who do all the ground fighting and pilot the gunmen. The Water caste do diplomacy, the Air caste drop bombs on people from above, and the Earth caste do all the boring technological development that no one cares about but needs to happen because it's a sci-fi setting. The Ethereals, naturally, are the leaders of the United Tau race because of course they put themselves at the top. In the span of a few thousand years, they went from a race of Stone Age barbarians to a star-spanning empire whose average level of tech is better than the Imperium's. And before you shit a brick, I said average level of tech, as in what Johnny Tau the Fire Warrior is likely to see day to day. I'll talk more about how it stacks up to other stuff later, don't you worry, Mr. Imperium fan writing fast at me in the comments. Eventually, the warp storms blanketing their little corner of space cleared up. Everyone in the Imperium except for the Mechanicus lost all records of the Tau's existence before reality decided to give the Tau a handicap. And even then, the Cogboys still had no idea that the Tau were anything but Civ 5 barbarians. So when the Imperium went to check what was in this part of the galaxy, since they just kinda forgot, they found an expansionist alien empire poking around the galaxy and asking if anyone would like to join the greater good. Indeed, several alien races near the Tau were integrated into their empire to varying degrees, such as the Crude and Vespid. There's also the Demiurge, who are supposedly replacement squats, but the actual squats are back now, so who the fuck knows what's up with them anymore. To make a very long story short, the Tau began annexing Imperial planets, and I want you to remember the word annexing, and integrating them into their empire. The Imperium naturally threw a hissy fit over this and declared the Damocles Crusade in response. At first it went well for them. There were some pains, like when they found out that Tau ships will obliterate anything at long range, but then some mad lad space marines got into broadside distance and fired everything, and the Tau rapidly retreated. Then things started not going well. Ships would arrive at their destinations completely separated from the rest of their fleet, making themselves very very easy pickings for the Tau. Any landings on Tau worlds after the first one went atrociously, and overall the Imperium learned that the Tau weren't just another random Xeno species to roll over and kill. After that, the relationship between the two became something kinda like the Cold War, except not really. There'd be occasional border skirmishes and an invasion every now and then, but also trade and cooperation against the occasional Tyranid Hive fleet and Orc Goon squad. Sure, they don't like each other, but given what's in the rest of the galaxy, they're more than happy to lay down their differences for just a moment if the need arises. I mean, if nothing else, what would you rather have as your neighbor? This or this? Let's take a break from the history and talk about the greater good, their guiding philosophy. To expand on it a little bit, the greater good is more or less the Tau philosophy on the universe and where the dead meme of them being communists comes from. It essentially means that each part works towards the betterment of the whole, each Tau and allied species contributing to the greater empire. Whatever course of action is best for most people is what they're gonna do. Granted, it just so happens that Tau are the majority race of the Tau Empire, but that's surely just semantics. Now, people who failed high school history class might immediately go, "Commie! Commie!" because McCarthyism is alive and well, but it really isn't. They have a caste system, the entire government is highly meritocratic, although at the same time rather nepotistic, and if nothing else, the Tau generally don't have to wait in lines for bread or toilet paper. If you're wondering what that sound was, it was everyone on the Sig Marxism subreddit doing a 180 on their opinion of me. TLDR, while there's an element of communism in the Tau, if you created what the Tau have in real life and told Karl Marx it was communism, he'd punch you in the throat. For all I said earlier about the Tau being good people by the standards of Warhammer, I meant it. I said to take heed of the word annexing earlier because that's what the Tau do. They annex worlds and the people on them. They aren't xenocidal. They're willing to make friends or at least allies with those who are willing in return. This has bit them in the ass before, which I'll get to, but it also lets them take over entire Imperial systems because the Imperium is the worst government possible. That was about half hyperbole for everyone on their way to list governments that may or may not be worse. Granted, humans and other races are often treated as second-class citizens, but even then they can still rise up to positions of power, and by the standards of 40k, that's hugely better than anyone else. All that being said, they're nice by the standards of 40k. Throw them in Star Trek and you've got a villain on your hands. They're highly expansionist and seldom refuse a chance to take over an Imperial world when the opportunity arises. Lore heavily hints that their ethereal leaders are using mind control pheromones to control other Tau, and people who are perhaps a bit too dissident may or may not be sent to a sterilization camp. Certain species are also on a list of beings that cannot be saved and must therefore be executed. But for context on how awful you need to be to get on that list, it's really only the Tyranids, Orcs, and Dark Eldar on it. Not exactly the races I'd call nice. Love also is not a thing in the Tau Empire, as the government literally assigns you a partner to breed with for the sole purpose of making new Tau. You also can't breed with another caste, and your child will be the same caste as you are. Much of this was added in response to people complaining the Tau were too nice, and I'd say GW did a decent job making them Grimnark while still making them nicer than the rest of the galaxy. One final thing I'd like to cover before I get into the pros and cons is their inspirations in real life. Naive weeaboo communists is an accusation often thrown at them, and like I said earlier, I don't think they're communists beyond a few commonalities. Naive? Well, we'll get to that one soon enough. And as for weeaboo, yes, but there's a lot more to it than them just being inspired by anime. There certainly is anime inspiration. I mean, they have battle suits that, to be honest with you, are just Gundam. That's not an insult, Gundam kicks ass, but there's a lot more to it than that. For instance, their entire society revolving around a caste system is similar to the ancient Hindu caste system. There's just no Aryans this time, though waving a Tau flag in the Imperium is at best probably going to get you the same response as waving a flag of the windmill of friendship and tolerance would in Germany today. They also take inspiration from Japan during the 1930s and 40s of all times. Their major expansion attempts are referred to as spheres of expansion, and would you look at what Japan was trying to create at the time, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In that same vein, it was viewed by Europe as an Eastern nation that at the time was new to being what they considered a proper industrial power and was trying to grow its influence. And sure enough, the Tau are located in the eastern arm of the galaxy and are a new yet relatively powerful civilization trying to expand themselves. So while calling them an army for weebs isn't really wrong, because mecha, there's also a lot more interesting influence than just anime here. The newcomers on the galactic block are ready to take on all challengers, or at least they think they are, so I go for the blueies. Well, let's get this out of the way so I don't have to keep bringing it up over and over again. The Tau are the closest you're going to get to actual good guys in this setting. Like I said earlier, compared to everyone else, they're a faction of Mother Teresa's. Even if you can argue that the Imperium and Eldar do the stuff they do out of necessity, the Tau aren't doing anything nearly at the same scale as them. Especially the Farside Enclaves, they're actually just straight up good guys. Not good guys by the standards of 40k, actually good guys. They kill orcs and have no mind control rulers and anything like that. The closest thing to evil they have is the titular Commander Farsight using a vampire sword, which is almost exclusively wielded against orcs. If anything, that's a goddamn civil service. Of course, by that same token, they also still do awful things because this is still Warhammer 40k. I know I'm repeating myself between these 2 points, so I'll make this quick. Tau have re-education camps, use mind control, and still treat other races like second-class citizens. The whole point of me saying this again is that ultimately you can run the entire spectrum of morality with the Tau, which is a positive. Whether you want a more good or evil viewpoint on them, they can accommodate you. Time to say something new now. The Tau, unlike pretty much every other faction in the game, represent progress. They aren't a dying feudal empire in space like the Imperium, and they aren't damned to eternal torment upon death like the Eldar. And of course, they aren't a shadow of their former selves like everyone, to be honest with you. They've only ever been going up in their society. There was no horrendous dark age following a golden age that will never be recreated. They've had plenty of setbacks, sure, but they haven't been hard reset like everyone else has. I guess the Tyranids haven't regressed much either, but the only thing they're progressing towards is a galactic buffet table, so I don't really count them personally. If you like anime, then oh boy are these the guys for you. Look at all these wonderful Gundam figures. Even the things that aren't Gundam still look like anime. I mean, look at the basic Fire Warriors, dirty them up a bit and tell me these guys don't belong in Cowboy Bebop or something like that. Combine that with the fact that the Tau are very distinctly Japanese in spite of the other historical inspirations, and you have a weeb's wet dream. It makes sense after all. One reason they were developed was to cash in on the Japanese market. But to avoid rooting this video with too much of my weeb crap, if you like weeb crap, you'll like the Tau. And even if you don't like anime, it's not hard to imagine the Tau battlesuits as Titans from Titanfall. There's also the Ghost from Halo for some reason. I mean, ghosts are fun to drive, I guess, so why not put it in the ranks? Bit of a tangent, but if you're a fan of playing the long game, you'll probably like the Tau. Because history runs in cycles, and as much as people don't want to admit it, the Tau are poised to become the next major superpowers in many ways. They haven't regressed really in any way, shape, or form, they're only ever expanding, and their neighbors are dying empires. Now I'm going to address their relative strength later, but consider ancient humanity in 40k really quickly. It had to contend with countless xenospecies, the subtle influence of chaos, and the colossal Eldar Empire of the time, and it still managed to become the galaxy-wide Imperium we know and love. The Tau similarly have to contend with a whole variety of incredibly strong enemies, but none of them are able to take the Tau out without weakening themselves on other fronts. And the Tau are both clever and strong enough to slowly expand at the perfect time to maximize gain and minimize loss. Well, I don't know if their galactic primacy would last very long when they finally achieve it, given that things like the Orcs and Tyranids exist, or to be honest with you, how such a thing would come about. The Tau are in many ways poised to take over when the Imperium finally cracks. Perhaps they won't be the last man standing, but for a decent bit of time I could see them being the dominant power. At least if Warhammer didn't run on plot armor and the Imperium shattered like it should have long ago, this would be the case. But a man can dream, and so can the Tau. And while this aspect of the Tau has unfortunately been downplayed more and more, the Tau are currently the closest thing to a federation that 40k has to offer. There's the Kroot, the Vespid, and the unfortunately underrepresented Demiurge as the major Tau allied species, and while there's no official tabletop model, there are millions of humans happy to fight for the Tau and serve its government. While yes, the Imperium also has client xenostates within itself, they aren't given nearly the same level of representation as they would get amongst the Tau. So if you like playing a xenophile empire in Stellaris, here's the army for you. Finally, the Tau are for a variety of reasons immune to being destroyed despite their small size. Militarily speaking, despite being possibly the smallest faction, they punch well above their weight class. Even Caiaphas Cain says if there's one thing that the Tau know how to do, it's put on a good war. He may be a coward, but he knows when someone is good at fighting. How else do you think he knows to run away from them? Because of this, no other faction can destroy them because such a thing would require committing more resources than they can spare. Massive Imperial Crusade coming? Hope the Emperor doesn't mind losing half his territory to Orcs and Chaos while it goes on. Chaotic Incursion? Sure, that'll suck. It'll suck for the god invading when the other three pounce on them for being distracted. Some of this is plot armor, I admit, but let me ask you a question. If the Imperium can regularly destroy Orc Waz with more orcs in them than a hive world has people, Marnius Caligar can destroy an Avatar of Cain in 1v1 combat, and Chaos Demons and Imperial Saints can resurrect themselves forever, why don't the Tau deserve the plot armor of not being instantly wiped? Doesn't seem like too much of an ask, truth be told. You can say it's unrealistic, sure, but people fight space battles like it's 17th century naval combat in this setting. The concept of realism and Warhammer 40k aren't exactly on speaking terms. One last final thing, the Tau are quite intelligent. Now I'm sure many people bring up the bit in Old War where the Eldar were uplifting them but abandoned the project because they were uncreative and had difficulty developing on their own. The Tau, that is. That's a fair point, but remember it was the Eldar saying that. Because the Tau have a very minor warp presence, the Eldar's version of uncreative may damn well have just been they can't do space magic, therefore who cares about these chumps. They went from Stone Age tech to Star Wars in 6,000 years. In our own history, we went from the Stone Age to ancient Egypt in roughly that time span. That's impressive whether or not they did that by themselves, let alone the fact they're able to understand and replicate all of it. They were able to analyze the Codex Astartes to predict space marine battle actions. They were able to constantly adapt to Tyranid fighting organisms so the hive mind in turn couldn't adapt to them. Say what you want about these bits of lore and whether or not they're total BS, but at the end of the day, the Tau clearly have some spark of genius buried inside of them. How about some tabletop positives? The Tau are all about range. If you like playing a sci-fi army that actually acts like a science fiction army instead of medieval knights with power armor, then you want the Tau, plain and simple. In the lore, they fight remarkably like an actual real-life army, practicing economies of scale and force and doing their best to minimize their own casualties while maximizing the enemy, not just charging headfirst into the fray with a chainsaw sword. And naturally, this means they use, guns, not fucking swords. What this means for the tabletop is that anything downrange of you is swiftly going to be reduced to cinders and ashes. Their basic infantry weapon is perhaps the single best basic infantry weapon in the game, hitting its strength 5 AP 1. For reference, a bolt rifle, which is essentially an RPG assault rifle gun, is strength 4 AP 1. And that's on beefed up Primaris Marines. If you're running old Firstborn, you get strength 4 AP 0, my friend. Beyond that, there's of course this thing, for when you need there to be more missiles in the air than oxygen. And of course the Tau Railgun, for when you absolutely, positively need to tell someone exactly where they can stick their invulnerable save. Because when someone's using one of these things, they don't get one. If an invulnerable save is that one asshole kid with an everything-proof shield, the Tau Railgun is when you punch that kid in the face for being a shitheel and ruining recess. There's dozens of specifics I can cover, but to save some time, anything with enough Tau weapons pointed at it is going to go away violently. The Tau can also be fairly easily built around causing a hefty amount of mortal wounds, which combined with the fact that the Tau are the kings of the ranged game means that any horde armies that can't close the gap are going to melt before your gun line. Unless you dwell on that loaded statement too much before we get to the cons, the Tau can fairly efficiently force armies into a ranged battle. They can also shoot in response to a charge for free, and it hits on a 5 instead of a 6 like everyone else. So don't fret if someone manages to close the gap, you aren't screwed quite yet. They're also a highly mobile army. Pretty much all units that aren't their basic infantry have the fly keyword and are decently fast to boot, so you'll have no trouble zooming around the board to get those units where they need to be. Want to deploy a unit of fire warriors behind enemy lines? Go for it. Jump a unit of battlesuits into the fray to turn the tide at just the right moment? Pretty sure that's what they're designed to do. And if not, it's a very cool mental image, so I'm gonna stick to being wrong if I am wrong. Between stratagems and just their plain old stat lines, their vehicles are also pretty tanky too. Sure, not Forces of Nurgle tanky, but that's hardly a complaint. And this extends to character units too, because drones. Drones can do all kinds of screwy things. They can help the Tau infantry be more accurate or hit a bit harder. They also have their own little pulse carbines, so they can do decently in battle as well. No worse than a fire warrior anyway. But most importantly, you can put them in front of a character and they can take a wound for them. This can take your standard Tau special little dude from 3 or 4 wounds to functionally having 12. Or more if you really want to tell someone to go to hell. Their auxiliaries can also fill in some gaps in their roster, even if only slightly. The Kroots certainly perform better in melee than the Tau and aren't the worst at ranged combat. Certainly not good, but could be worse. If nothing else, they're also decent meat shields for important things, so there's always that. They've even got this thing, which is decent at melee and ranged on top of being respectably fast, at the cost of looking really, really stupid. I don't know how to word this, but I don't think it looks like a bad model, it just looks dumb. Like they definitely feed this thing glue for breakfast. Vestmen, meanwhile, are fast as all hell and can rain down some punishment, the perfect flankers for the fire warriors going up the middle. For one final point worth mentioning, the Manta. This thing is 25 inches long and 34 inches wide. It is 28 pounds. Here are its stats. If anyone tells you that the Tau don't have a Titan, they're right, but they also clearly don't need one. Suck on that, Mechanicus. Did you note that this model can only make melee attacks against units that can fly? I'm sorry for all of you who can not only afford the Tau Manta, but also planned on using it like a bloodthirster. I hope the entire army's worth of firepower it can unleash makes up for that fact. Now for some lore downsides. Something you'll shortly notice is that I have more bad things to say about the Tau than good. That's not because I hate them, I quite like them in fact. It's just that there's a lot of things about them that I view as downsides. Downsides in the sense of do or don't anyway, not necessarily things that are awful about them, if that makes any sense. Now that I've done that little word of warning, let's talk shop. Something simple to get started with. If you prefer 40k's aesthetic of science fiction mixed with a feeling of both medievalism and lost glory, you don't want the Tau. There's none of that here because they've only really been going up in life. Not much to say really, just if you like old stuff being the best stuff, then you don't want the Tau. Moving on, something you might have noticed if you've been a long-time fan of the channel is that every time I show the Tau on a map, I surround them with Tyranids and play that screaming sound effect I'm 99% certain is from gay porn. Not that I'm in any rush to confirm that fact, but I have my suspicions. That's because to say that the Tau are outnumbered and outgunned is an understatement. While I mentioned earlier that I think the Tau are likely to become a major superpower if history running in cycles is a belief you ascribe to, there's also the fact that at the moment they're a small fish in an ocean full of megalodons. While no faction can devote enough resources to destroy the Tau and they can punch well above their weight class, others can certainly devote enough to seriously harm them. The Damocles Crusade, while it didn't end in Tau destruction and was rather embarrassing for the Imperium, didn't really cost it that much. Despite the fact the Tau actually gained a few worlds out of the mess, they arguably came out worse for wear after because the Imperium can afford billions of losses in a campaign. The Tau really can't. Not repeatedly anyways. This also means that a variety of things can ruin the Tau Empire. If Abaddon for some reason decided an entire Black Crusade needed to be thrown to the Tau, they're just screwed. If the Tyranids ever arrive en masse rather than the scouting forces most high fleets have been thus far, say goodbye Tau Empire, straight to the stummy of some angry bugs. Also, you're just gonna have to live with the fact I said the word stummy twice now. I'll say it again, stummy. You can't stop me. Let's not forget the Farside Enclaves either. They have, I believe, 4 entire star systems in their name. In 40k, that's nothing. That's less than nothing. They are to the Tau what the Tau are to the rest of the galaxy in terms of numbers. Relatedly, while their average level of technology is better than almost everyone else's but the Necrons and the Eldar, they lack the real big stuff that admittedly only ever makes an appearance in lore. But this is the lore section, so that's a valid criticism. They've got no archaeotech time-distorting superweapons like the Imperium, or devices that can turn a planet inside out like the Eldar, or the funny Necron button that can set any star in the galaxy to go supernova. Thank you for that one, GW writers. Very cool and balanced. While I have no doubt the Tau will eventually develop such things, they're a long ways off from it, and that can hurt them if anyone decides that things are getting desperate enough. There's a variety of reasons why each of these things those factions have aren't used, but at the end of the day, other people have those things and the Tau don't. To go back to an earlier point, let's talk about the naive part in naive weeaboo communists. It's been downplayed more and more given that the Tau have been around the block for a decent amount of time, but they're still in many ways in the dark about what's really in the galaxy. At least all but the highest echelons of their leadership are. A story that gets told a lot, but it's funny, so here it is again, is that when they first heard about Titans, they thought it was Imperial propaganda. Surely no one would be stupid enough to invest so many resources into a single war machine. That's unbelievably wasteful. A single Titan's worth of resources could supply an army. Then those churches in the distance started walking towards them, and yeah, they learned pretty quickly that Titans aren't propaganda. They also don't really understand just how big the galaxy is, as evidenced by the time a Tau ambassador visited a hive world that was briefly struck with awe and more importantly horror when he realized that the hive world had more humans on it alone than there were Tau in the entire galaxy. And my favorite little anecdote, the time they trusted the Dark Eldar to be good people. The Dark Eldar took some Tau back to Kamara as foreign exchange students in return for helping the Tau against some Tyranids, then deployed those Tau as monsters that would make a Skaven proud on the field of battle. When the Tau saw what their brothers and sisters had become, they went to fire on the Dark Eldar. The Dark Eldar laughed and flipped them the bird before running away and kidnapping an entire planet's worth of Tau. I know they didn't meet them before and didn't know just how awful the Deldar are, but I mean, look at them. Who trusts someone who looks like this? I know they say don't judge a book by its cover, but when it's covered in spikes and flayed skulls, maybe just this once it's okay to do that. Anyways, point is that the Tau are in the dark about just how awful the galaxy is and just how far out of their league they are a lot of the time. Lastly for lore, or at least lastly until I think of something else and then say lastly twice because I'm too lazy to go back and redo the script, see also a few minutes ago in this very video, is something that funnily enough applies both to the lore and tabletop, so here's the segue to the Tabletop Cons. They fight like a modern army, which makes them stand out and lends them a sense of realism. Realism is not something that generally survives first contact with 40k. So while realistically they shouldn't be losing when some goober charges them across an open field with a sword, this isn't real life, it's 40k. So yeah, they get chopped into bits a lot because people in this setting don't recognize projectiles as a real threat. Speaking of getting chopped to bits, you're probably already well aware that the Tau aren't the kind of army you want in a melee fight, like at all. They perform about as well as Guardsmen, which is to say very poorly. Problem there is that Guardsmen are designed to die so that things can do their job well, Fire Warriors aren't. Really the only Tau model that can do melee with any level of true proficiency is Commander Farsight with his vampire sword thing. While their unparalleled range game means that they have a decent shot of cutting people down before they close the gap, anything that does manage to get close is going to ruin your day. And while I wouldn't want to get punched by a battle mech that's as tall as my house, that doesn't mean that's what it's designed to do. Any dedicated melee army getting to choppy range is a death sentence for you, so heads up on that. The range game is also pretty heavily reliant on marker lights. To sum it up, imagine a laser sight pointed at someone, except when you hit them with it, it stays on them. Using marker lights well allows the Tau to hit shots that otherwise they likely wouldn't, and turns their already impressive range game into something that's damn near unbeatable. Problem is, if you can't land a marker light shot for one reason or another, the Tau don't shoot any better than a Guardsman. If your sources of marker lights are destroyed or you're just unlucky with rolls, you can have a perfect plan and it might not matter because you hit only half the time and Coordinate Berserkers don't really care about things like bullets. Their steady diet of glue and crayons makes them immune, you see. Critical use of your marker lights is key, and while using them as a distraction is a valid tactic, you need to be careful with that before your well thought out trap turns into just shooting yourself in the foot. I mentioned earlier how a lot of the units had the fly keyword, which is a major buff to their mobility. Their predictable downside is that anti-aircraft fire is going to send a lot of these units plummeting to the ground like Black Hawk Down in space. You'll need to know what each enemy unit can do as well as what your own army can do with the Tau. While it isn't like the Eldar where a certain unit is only really good in a certain situation, for the Tau it's more along the lines of knowing what units can get through and what's going to shred them like paper. Your Battlesuits jumping in to save the day isn't going to happen when Jerry the Guardsman kicks back at his AA gun and blows them all out of the sky because you thought that having 4 wounds made you a god among men. Their auxiliaries are also pretty meh in the grand scheme of things. This is largely due to a lack of support in comparison to the battle mechs. Sure, Battletech is cool and I'm glad Games Workshop agrees, but allied alien species are also cool and there's a very limited amount of those to get. A mainly crewed force is just gimping yourself. If you want to play a mainly Vespid force, I don't know what to tell you. They're relatively niche units, good at their specific roles, but beyond that, not great, and certainly not something to build an army out of. It's very fun to see them on the tabletop instead of the 50th Hammerhead, but unfortunately being unique and interesting means nothing in the eyes of Games Workshop. Lastly, money. Tau models are expensive both in-game and in real life. Losing a big unit can be crippling. Not to nearly the same extent as the Imperial Knights or Custodes, but enough to where throwing battlesuits at a problem until it goes away isn't really a viable tactic. In terms of real-life money, take a look at the Storm Surge. Look at that! Isn't that just so cool? Turns out they didn't just copy mecha in general, they copied the price of importing the goddamn things from Japan. So get ready to shell out some fun bucks if you want to collect the Tau. And that's the basics of the Tau done and done. Hope you enjoyed the video, and remember... No, that's it. Just remember. Thank you, of course, to my wonderful channel members. You were the pulse rifle to my fire warrior, something steadfast and reliable to get me through the days ahead. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. I'm also very sorry to break your heart, but Tau women don't have boobs. At all. Sorry, Chief, they're not mammals. All of that fan art is at best Imperial propaganda. Is what I would tell you if I was a goddamn fool. Big titty fish mommy took over the galaxy in endless space, and Warhammer 40k, let's go!